So welcome everyone to another Star Wars RPG community GM workshop. Today we have Dave, a veteran of our workshop series and host or co-host of our GM discussion panel Spice Pushes, which is on every month if you're interested in that. He's here to talk to us about what makes Star Wars feel like Star Wars and how you can kind of get that feeling into your games to make players feel like they're living in the universe.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Key.
No worries.
I am Dave, as your GM. Haha. And today we're going to talk about that Star Wars feeling. So I finished up an Edge of the Empire campaign back in June. I wanted to start a Force and Destiny game in July. And while Edge of the Empire invites lots of humor and quirks, I wanted to facilitate a game that had a feeling of being, based on legend, not necessarily legendary in terms of my performance. I'm only so good, but I'm not looking to compliment myself, but something that had kind of an Arthurian feel, something very Celtic. We'll see the outcome. I've only gotten about 9 sessions in, so we'll see how well this technique goes. But I was worthwhile to me between June and July to sit down and really pare down that Star Wars feeling. And most of the information that you're going to see, this is not a body of work of mine. This is collected things from Star Wars fans over the years, things that they've looked at. In particular, I remember checked out the Leonard Maltin interviews that took place with the THX editions, the Myth and the Magic specials that came out in the 2000s, the gallery episodes that you see tied to The Mandalorian. Those are really good as well. And I wanted to codify them all in one place for my fellow GMs. And this is kind of a ambitious goal because I firmly believe that a good movie can be made through competence. Competently acted, directed, filmed, edited, scored, etc. These make a movie good, but a great movie makes you forget that it was made by people. It has a sort of naturalness to it, and this is easier to do when children are your audience. But there comes a point when you're watching a truly great movie where you stop trying to figure out how things are made, unless you're really into that sort of thing. You just sit, you're drawn into it. It's as if those things are actually happening and there's just someone with a camera watching them and you are along for the ride. And that is kind of the goal that I'm aiming for, and it is a tough goal. Like I said, I may do a workshop on this next year after I finish up that campaign and then see how well I actually accomplish that goal. Also, just so you all know, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have a question about a slide, go ahead and type it in. I'll be more than happy to give it an answer before moving on to the next one. All right, here's the obligatory slide of slides. We're going to be talking about things from the book, atmosphere, settingisms, care and description, the hero's journey in Monomyth. I'm so sorry, but yes, we are. Recontextualization, a bit about tone, and talking about expanded versus restricted art. And I'll do more specifics on that topic when we get to it, but it is very important to the overall workshop today. So, from the book, there is in fact a sidebar literally titled That Star Wars Feeling. It is on page 294 of Force and Destiny. Our guidelines from the developers of the game state, the game and plot should be fast-paced and entertaining, have a dash of humor, and feature moments of high drama and tension, as Star Wars tends to do. The GM should limit or avoid plots that run counter to expectations, and expectations are very important. One of the advantages of throwing out a post or something like that, looking for players, that sort of things, is that you can be upfront about your expectations with those players and say, hey, this is kind of what the game is going to be about. This is the type of character that will be the most compatible with it, etc., etc. And GMs should also give the players an indication that their story may address non-traditional Star Wars themes. They mention things like zombies and horror and things like that, especially. But it's important to do this because you don't want to build a campaign based around tales of scandalous ribaldry on feudal Alderaan, and then the 12-year-old Timmy who's shown up, saw Star Wars and showed up, says, how long until the Death Star blows us all up? Obviously he's going to be a bit disappointed, and the Star Wars feeling is now broken for him. Let's talk about things we can do to establish this atmosphere. This is advice you will see a lot in the GM discussion panel and elsewhere, even in other game systems. It is advice you will get everywhere, but it is very good advice. Obviously, music, of course, said you recommend works by our beloved John Williams, of course. But with BioWare, for slumber points of zombies like Rackles, sure. Rackles, they do have zombie-like elements to them, certainly, but that is like the theme of a single specific planet, especially in the Old Republic setting. So they work on that planet really well. But also the BioWare, speaking of BioWare, the BioWare Star Wars The Old Republic soundtrack is available for free. You can, and when I say free, I mean it's free. You don't have to download a downloader to get it or anything like that, or sign up for anything. It's about 20-something track, including about half a dozen really quirky Cantina-style tracks, which I absolutely love. But in addition to that, there's lots of YouTube playlists. You got your Spotify, of course, if you have that available to you, and things like that. Also, tabletopaudio.com for ambient loops, some with, some without music. I've started using those as well. They stream really well on Foundry, I find. But also, depending on what tools you use to run your game, you also want to consider visual and tactile aids if you're on Roll20, Tabletop Simulator, Foundry VTT. Of course, you want your piles upon piles of pucks. I like to use these kind of generic numbered pucks that you see over here on the right that portray, kind of just various silhouettes, because one of the guidelines when designing characters at Lucasfilm for Star Wars is you have to be able to recognize a character just by silhouette. So you can give an impression of what players are looking at just through these silhouettes. You can just use a set of stormtrooper helmets for minions and things like that. Maps and terrain can help facilitate atmosphere. If you decide to use dry erase maps, my pro tip is to cut them along their folding lines. That way you can reconfigure them in a greater range of angles and configurations, and you can draw on them and make a greater range of maps that way. And you can you can reveal just the portion that the players are standing on as they explore. Some other good sources, miniatures, of course. Don't hurl a bunch of money into miniatures just to facilitate that far Star Wars feeling. I ran an entire D&D campaign using just paper standees that I would fold in half and place in little. I'd take a wooden dowel, cut it in half, and cut a slot along it. Place the paper standee in, work just as well as any miniature, and best of all, you can take your pick of whatever artwork you want to use. So that's pretty good. And of course, I have my custom little silhouette pucks here that I like quite a bit. But yes, establish the atmosphere, definitely. This is, again, like I said, advice you will get everywhere, but it is excellent advice. All right, let's talk about some settingism, some things that do or do not appear in Star Wars. First of all, do wheels appear in Star Wars? Like even going back to the original trilogy? Well, yes, R2-D2, the mouse droid. But remember, those wheels were kind of tucked inside of the chassis, so you couldn't really see them very well. You knew they were there. You could hear them rolling. But the idea was to tuck those away because they're kind of something we know a little too well. The A6 Juggernaut I have here in a picture. Usage, there should be some strangeness to the usage of this. My biggest error when describing a scene in Star Wars is I will describe a door swinging open. Doors in Star Wars do not swing open. They're not on hinges. They are almost always pneumatic sliding doors. And so I always say, I have to teach myself to say hisses and slides. That sort of thing. Video screens and holograms, maybe some low color CGA. Holograms instead of video. I have to remember holocast rather than radio broadcast, that sort of thing. Also, glasses. Yes, glasses do exist in the Star Wars universe, for sure. But there was actually, after the Doctor character from The Mandalorian popped up, there was actually a series of articles online about, hey, wait a minute, why is this guy wearing glasses? Does anybody wear glasses in Star Wars? You really haven't had a lot of main characters wear glasses, but they do appear. I'd recommend referring to them as spectacles instead of glasses, because glasses is kind of a 20th century term that caught on instead of spectacles. And speaking of terminology, What the heck is wrong with laser sword anyway? Why does lightsaber sound so good, and why does laser sword sound so awkward? Um, my and just from my perspective, my feeling is that the laser sword, for starters, the word laser is the laser itself is a 20th century specific invention. You're basically tying something very specific to the 20th century to a weapon, and that kind of keeps someone in the 20th century as they read it. But lightsaber, what's special about it especially is the saber, which is a not just a sword, but a dated style of blade. It was a symbol of an officer or a knight's authority. We are, of course, talking about Jedi Knights. And so, um, and this kind of helps give us a guideline that I'll talk about in a little bit. But also sensors and scopes. Don't talk about radar because, again, radar is a specific 20th century invention. I joked once that laser sword was basically the equivalent of one of your parents referring to the Xbox as the Nintendo. Turn off the Nintendo and do your homework. Death Star versus photonic array. And in addition, Star Wars is really supposed to be technology agnostic. They don't explain technology in the films. Some of the supplementary material does produce a lot of explanations for technology. There's a ton of it in the game books itself, but you're not obligated to explain how things work. It's more about fulfilling a role or a function that the viewer can understand and be interested in, that they understand the implications of its existence. So when the Death Star is talked about in the first act of Star Wars, we don't know what it does. It does kind of have this outdated, vague, ominous terminology. And then at the start of the second act, boom, blows up Alderaan. Suddenly the stakes are established and we understand this is what the Death Star is. This is the risk that it symbolizes. Something needs to be done about it. And if you don't do something about it, things are going to get worse. But as a fun sort of exercise, let's grade a couple of super weapons that have popped up in other Star Wars works outside of the movies. Starting with the Star Forge. I give this an A+. This is a fantastic super weapon name. You have an outdated component, which is the Forge. You have the vagueness of it, and you also have a certain ominousness to it. Imagine if it was called the Star Factory. It would be so obvious what it does. But the Star Forge, does it forge stars? Does it forge something from stars? But again, they borrowed something from the first Star Wars movie in the Knights of the Old Republic, which is that they held off on showing exactly what it was the Star Forge did. And when you find out that it is this massive factory that can produce an entire army just by siphoning hydrogen off of a sun, the threat becomes a lot more immediate and more better understood. And that's something that KOTOR replicated from the original Star Wars, and it did it incredibly well. All right, from the Dark Horse comics, though, the Dark Reaper. This is a device that siphons the force from around it and potentially kills people. I give this a B-. Okay, it's got the Reaper, which is, of course, someone who cuts your grass or cuts a vegetation and things like that. Vague, yeah, good. Ominous, a little too on the nose of ominousness, but also it's a Warhammer 40k unit as well, so it's a little too edgelord for my tastes. So it kind of misses out. It's not that it's not vague; it's just vague in the wrong way. I give it a B- though. I think it's pretty good. All right, and feel free to grade these yourselves as you go, as in the chat if you want. These are kind of interesting. Okay, the Galaxy Gun. I give this a D-. For starters, you got alliteration. You also have gun, which was traditionally used for an artillery piece, which is kind of what the Galaxy Gun does in Dark Empire 2. But the problem is, these days we use the term gun for just about any type of firearm. You could scale back to like the Emperor's Spear or something like that, but even that's a little hokey. So misses out on outdated, misses out on vague, misses out on ominous. So I give the Galaxy Gun a D-. Prison Planet from the Star Wars Old Republic MMO. I give this a C minus. Not outdated. Prisons have been around for a while. Maybe Planet Dungeon. I don't know. Not too vague. A little too obvious about what it does. And ominous. Okay, you're stuck on your planet. That's kind of the norm for most planets right now. So maybe that doesn't feel like such a threat to the player. So I give Planet Prison a C minus.
We have a little question about the Dark Reaper in the chat.
Yeah, is there?
Whether it's a Dark Brotherhood era superweapon.
I don't think it was. I think it was something that was found in the one of Exar Kun's artifacts that was found on Yavin 4. It's been a little while since I read that one, but I could be wrong.
We just had a rating for Prison Planet as a solid F.
Solid F. Okay. Yeah. I give it a D minus. It does have the vagueness, but it's maybe just too vague. But yeah, Prison Planet. I think that was part of the Trooper storyline, and the Trooper storyline was pretty weak, as a lot of people say. Okay. Here comes the big slide. We're gonna talk for a little bit about the Monomyth, the hero's journey, and Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. There is a special moment in every Star Wars fan's life when you learn about Joseph Campbell and the Hero with a Thousand Faces. And if this is your moment, I'm so sorry. So Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist or comparative folklorist who published The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949. Where he made an effort to codify commonalities that existed between legends across different cultures. He was not the first or the last person to attempt to do this. Probably the best known person was Carl Jung, who was much earlier in the 20th century. But prior to Campbell, this was mostly done by anthropologists and psychologists. And there's also been some criticisms of Joseph Campbell's methodology that's not really scientific. But this is literature and storytelling. This is not chemistry. And there's also been some serious criticisms of its overuse. And I certainly remember reading a lot of Terry Brooks's Shannara novels when I was in middle school. And a couple of years later, when I learned about the hero's journey, I thought back to those novels and realized, wow, those were really on the nose. And apparently George Lucas thought the same way because Terry Brooks was assigned to write the novel adaptation of the sequel trilogy. But when Lucas was finishing up with THX and with American Graffiti, he was working on Star Wars. He was struggling a bit, and then he picked up Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it really helped codify what he was trying to do with Star Wars. It was like, oh, this is someone who figured out what I've been trying to do, but they figured it out like 20 years ago. And so the monomyth is described as being cycle-like. This image that you see here is taken from Wikipedia, so this is kind of their version of it. You have basically the three acts of it: the departure, the initiation, and the return. I won't read every single one of these out loud. Also, some of these are kind of weird titles, but these are the titles of chapters in the hero's journey section of Hero with a Thousand Faces. These are not meant to be literal things that happen in every single adventure. In many cases, sections of it will not happen, or they will be skipped, or they will happen multiple times. But usually there is a point where the hero leaves the departure section, goes into initiation, leaves an initiation, goes to the return, leaves the return, and becomes a part of something else. Oftentimes, they become a part of someone else's departure. But I do want to emphasize a couple of things here, especially. Let me see. Especially the departure. The departure is very, very important for us as GMs, because if you look at this list here, A, B, C, D, and E, you have all of the essential parts of an adventure hook. You have the call to adventure. In Star Wars, you could imagine that different fans disagree on this, but some say, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope," is the call to adventure. Others say, "You must come with me to Alderaan if you are to learn the ways of the Force." That's the call to adventure. There's the refusal of the call. The refusal is not simply the hero saying no, but the hero being confronted with the consequences of that refusal. So you could say, Luke, Alderaan, I'm not going to Alderaan. That could be considered the refusal, but also his return to his moisture farm, seeing the charred remains of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, realizing that this is something that could just as easily happen to anyone else looking for these droids. That is the consequence of his refusal. Although his refusal doesn't necessarily lead directly to it, but in kind of a storytelling sense, it does. This also pops up more recently in the Kenobi show, where Obi-Wan Kenobi just flat out refuses to help anyone for a long time. Near the end of that first episode, he sees that one Padawan hanging in the town square and realizes, well, if I don't do something, this is going to happen to someone else. You have the supernatural aid. Again, Star Wars fans disagree on this. This is your father's lightsaber, that sort of moment. Or it's a fast ship, make 0.5 past light speed, that sort of thing. And then, of course, the crossing the first threshold. I think most fans agree that the departure from Tatooine, the Millennium Falcon blasting off, because at that point, not only is Luke wanted, and the droids are wanted, and Obi-Wan is wanted, but they're now associated with a smuggler. There is no way they can go back to Tatooine without being flagged. There's no going back at that point. And the Belly and the Whale, again, it's basically the Death Star. It's you're trapped there, and as soon as you leave, you're finally on the initiation and the road of trials. Now, the majority of our games after the initiation. Oh, go ahead.
Question about the call to adventure.
Yeah.
Luke was always eager to explore the galaxy. Would it mean that he always had the call to adventure?
Well, that's actually a component of the crossing of the first threshold. The threshold is something that stands as a barrier to the hero. Even before the call to adventure, I'd like to put in my application to the Academy this year. That sort of thing. But there is something, the price tag, the obligations to family. There is something that has kept Luke on Tatooine. And we call that the threshold. It's kind of nebulous, but initially that threshold is usually the source of the refusal in some way. Let's see. Now, the majority of our games will take place in the initiation, especially the Road of Trials, which is kind of where, the meat of our adventures are. And we will get more to that. The Return might make an interesting campaign on its own. Surprisingly few authors focus on the Return. It's the most misunderstood part. This is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. That sort of thing. That's the typical example of the story of a return. They must overcome new challenges to return some sort of boon to the known world. But let's redraw this and retitle these to something that connects a little bit better to Star Wars. So here's the Journey Redrawn. We have the Call, the Refusal, the Mentor and Helper, the Inability to Return, and the Labyrinth, of course. I call it the Labyrinth. The Death Star is the Labyrinth. Our Road of Trials, you have that acknowledgement. There is some moment in the character's life on the road of trials where a higher power tells them, you are on the right track. You are doing the right thing. But the most important part of the road of trials, I would say, is the crossroads. This is very much join me and we can rule the galaxy as father and son. You have the reconciliation, which, of course, for Star Wars takes place more in the Return of the Jedi, but you can see kind of how the Road of Trials is very, very different. It's very much Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. The discovery of something of the past that was once forgotten, and of course the ascension into something else, into, I would say, not into the initiation into an even greater power. Luke, so be it Jedi. That is very much the ascension for Luke. But there is the way that Lucas used the hero's journey is a bit different from most authors, because as I will show you on the next slide, there is an overlap of characterization that exists between the characters that you see in his movies. So at the start of A New Hope, you have Luke kind of experiencing the call and the initiation. Vader is stuck in his road of trials. He very much failed the crossroads, and so he is frozen there as a result of his actions. But Obi-Wan Kenobi is in his return. He has no refusal because, again, remember, not every legend has to include every single component of the hero's journey. But, he has his departure, the unlikely aid, his crossing as well. He, of course, is killed by Vader, but in doing so, crosses over into, becomes one with the Force, achieves a mastery and a freedom to communicate with Luke when it is needed most, which is very important. And what I especially love about the Kenobi series, I don't love everything about the Kenobi series, but you have that moment at the 6 o'clock position, the darkest moment where a character experiences the death and the rebirth. Watching Kenobi, there are so many references to being buried or killed or being dead. Like Obi-Wan in the Kenobi series, he's not living in his hut that we see in A New Hope. He's living in a cave that is conspicuously tomb-like. Like I'm seeing, Passion of the Christ type tomb almost there. It's a little on the nose. His lightsaber is buried alongside Anakin's lightsaber, and most importantly, in his duel with Obi-Wan, not his duel with Obi-Wan, in his duel with Vader, he is literally buried in rocks, and thus the Obi-Wan who has been racked with guilt over having to face his best friend and maim his best friend is buried, and the Obi-Wan who is freed from that guilt emerges and enters into the return, in a way. Okay, but let's get out of that spiritual mumble jumbo for just a minute. But I think one of the reasons why the hero's journey is so relatable in terms of storytelling, and why you see it in so many places, you see it in The Matrix, you see it in Lord of the Rings. In fact, Peter Jackson went to some lengths to add pieces of the hero's journey to the existing parts of Lord of the Rings. There's that moment where Samwise Gamgee says, "If I take one more step, this is the furthest away I'll have ever been from the Shire." That is the threshold for him. But this is because, at least the way I see it, is we kind of live lives of multiple smaller heroic journeys, and this creates a sense of relatability to a bigger adventure. We get older, and we kind of start to play roles in other people's heroes' journeys. When you're a kid, you can't tie your own shoes. You have to get someone else to tie your own shoes. Then one day, you suddenly learn, and there's that barrier to going outside and playing, out in the yard has now gone. And eventually, though, there is a point where you perhaps teach someone else to tie their own shoes. Okay, let's get to something easier. Recontextualization. This is, again, a suggestion that you will see a lot in the GM discussion area, but this is, again, excellent advice. Yes, do this. On Spice Pushers, we always have that segment where we recontextualize a movie, as long as it is not a Western or a samurai movie or World War II. The reason we do that is because it's just too easy to recontextualize a Western or samurai or World War II movie into Star Wars, because that's exactly what George Lucas did. So for our Edge of the Empires, we have our Westerns, of course, the Searchers. There's some imagery from Star Wars taken directly from the Searchers. This is a storytelling format of law by choice, as much or as little as those in power choose to enforce. Two strangers on the same trail. No one can see what one does to the other. They could steal, they can murder, they can take the identity of someone, leave them for dead, etc. But again, another stranger can always join the trail, and the bill for evil deeds eventually comes due. A lot of Westerns deal with utopias, a phenomenon in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century in the US. I have the urchins in one of my games who are like this scrapyard gang of little kids who have basically established their own society away from the evil of adults. And once you reach the age where you tend to develop the kissing, as they put it, you are expelled from from the scrapyard, kind of like Little Lamplighter in Fallout. But it's also a chance to start over. You know what? Pop open Edge of the Empire, look at the list of obligations. You have 100 reasons. Well, specifically, you have 10 reasons why someone may want to start over in a new land. Um, for Age of Rebellion, we got our World War II movies. This is specifically the Dambusters inspired the Death Star trench attack. This is based upon. If you can't find a copy of the Dambusters, look up Operation Chastise on Wikipedia sometime. This is an amazing story about how the Allies developed one specific weapon and one specific delivery process for breaking open dams. It's a very amazing story. I won't throw a multitude of it out at you all at once, but it's a combination of cunning and technology and courage, and it is really an amazing story. This is mission oriented, as World War II movies tend to be. Players are given goals, they're ordered to complete them. They're given no specifics of how to complete. They're expected to use their ingenuity. I think ingenuity should especially be emphasized in Age of Rebellion. Multitude of variations, though. If you want to have some spies, some ship combat, dogfighting and bombing, mixed unit tactics, commando stuff, but also if you want to have some desk drama, some wartime romance, a prison break, super weapons, you have the Nemesis, of course. Lots of Clone Wars options. Like I said, the Nemesis from Clone Wars Season 1 is based on the sinking of the Bismarck. But yes, World War II movies are a solid source for Age of Rebellion. And Samurai, of course, gives us our inspiration for Force and Destiny. Lucas was inspired by The Hidden Fortress, which is a story told from the perspective of two peasants who would inspire R2-D2 and C-3PO. And the plot of this actually bears a greater resemblance to The Phantom Menace than it does to the original Star Wars trilogy, with royalty being escorted in secret by a samurai. But also, the most recontextualized movie of all time, well, second most recontextualized behind Pride and Prejudice, provides us with a means to an excellent example of value conflict or the morality system. There is a scene where Kanbai Shimada, in Japan, often someone who undertakes a particular lifelong ambition will begin to grow their hair, and then when they feel that they've completed it or feel that they need to move on, they will cut their hair. In fact, it is often when a beloved sumo wrestler retires, they will actually televise the ceremony of the sumo's haircutting. But there's a scene in Seven Samurai where Kanbei Shimada shaves his head, doesn't just cut his hair, but shaves his head so that he can pose as a monk in order to save a young mother and her child from a bandit. And the movie just lingers on this scene because Kanbei is basically sacrificing the recognition of his lifelong work to save two lives. And it lingers for a long time on him shaving his head and the peasants bowing in thankfulness. And his actual confrontation with the bandit is not even really shown. He jumps into the house, the bandit jumps out with a knife in his belly. That's it. But don't neglect the works of Western chivalry. You know, knights, the Jedi are called Jedi Knights after all. So take a look at some of those as well. You know, your Excaliburs, things like that. All right, another subject. Let's talk about tone. Star Wars tends to have a certain sincere tone to it. Adding ray guns and laser swords to another work doesn't necessarily turn it into Star Wars, and not every avenue of storytelling needs to be Star Wars. In 1999, when The Phantom Menace came out, there was another movie that used a lot of postmodern photography, broached on a great many philosophical concepts, and actually was very competitive with Star Wars, and it came out the very same year. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called The Matrix. It was pretty good. I don't know. Check it out. And in 2002, the same year as Attack of the Clones, a TV show came on TV that kind of deconstructed certain Western tropes and characters and sought to pursue meaning by exposing the contradictions of those characters. It turned out pretty popular, though. It was canceled kind of early. Maybe you've heard of it. It was called Firefly. But in general, tone wise, characters can be sarcastic, but the story should not be. Parable Star Wars it's not a morality tale really, or it barely is. The problem with Parable is that once your audience or your players figure out the parable, this can hurt the experience for them because once you figure out the goal of the parable, either the characters presented in the story by fudge, lost my train of thought. Either they can accept the parable and be spared, or they can deny the parable and be destroyed. That tends to be the two outcomes of the parable. Subversion. Characters, yes. NPCs, sometimes. But this subversion is very difficult to do, and it is not the same as a plot twist. It's again, I know Star Wars. We don't like to talk about subversion for a reason. That's completely understandable. But the key really to subversion is especially with Star Wars is you have something that players or your audience kind of understands. And my best example of subversion is from, of course, Game of Thrones. You have the Jaime, Cersei, Robert Baratheon. I wouldn't call it a love triangle. I'd call it more of a hate triangle. And this is a subversion of Guinevere, Lancelot, King Arthur. And so Guinevere, Lancelot, King Arthur gives us the basis for understanding why Cersei, Jaime, and Robert Baratheon is so twisted and wrong. That's good subversion. The problem is you can't really self-subvert Star Wars because Star Wars, it tends to work better as a sincere work. Deconstructive. This is the pursuit, like I said, the pursuit of meaning by exposing contradictions. I've never seen a successful deconstruction. Well, there's kind of been successful deconstruction of Star Wars. In a way, parts of Firefly were kind of like that. Also, meta. Meta is a narrative system in which the characters of the story have an awareness of the media representation of what they're doing. Like the movie Scream, obviously everybody in the movie Scream has seen a slasher movie. They see the parallels to their lives to the slasher movie. That's meta. That's an example of meta. There is one meta moment in the original Star Wars trilogy, and it is in this image right here, where Luke and Han are brought before Jabba the Hutt, and Han says to Luke, "How we doing?" And Luke says, "Same as always." And Han says, "That bad, huh?" The two characters have a keen awareness. I almost think that must have been ad-libbed between the two of them because it is just a little too meta for that. All right, so last major...
Dave,
go ahead.
before you move on, I have a question about the death of democracy as a theme, and is that not parable in Star Wars?
It could be. It's very ham-fisted, honestly, in the prequel trilogy, because what you have to remember is it was kind of oh Lord, I don't even want to talk about it a bit, but like I said, it was very ham-fisted. But yes, there is that parable in the prequel trilogy, and again, either some people figure out the parable and are spared. Obi-Wan is spared, Bail Organa is spared, Luke and Leia are spared. Some people fail to realize the parable and are destroyed. Darth Vader is destroyed in some way, but also Mace Windu is destroyed. Most of the Jedi are destroyed. Although as storytelling moves on and on, we suddenly find that a surprising number of Jedi got away. But that is the side effect of parable. Kind of one of those two things happen. But yes, that is a component of the prequel trilogy. Feelings about it are mixed. I don't want to make this a criticism of the prequel trilogy too much, but yes, it is something that maybe should have gotten a second review before it was published or became part of the film. It kind of hurts the timelessness of it, although, But let us just one more big slide. No text on it at all. So, the big question, though, do these guidelines and restrictions hurt Star Wars? One of the things that I see in discussions of the current works is that Star Wars needs to expand, it needs to grow, it needs to cast off its past, that sort of thing. I disagree, and here is why. It is not uncommon for an artist to restrict how they paint, or what rhythms they choose, or what instruments they choose, to, or etc., to create a continuous theme through a collection of works, and to challenge themselves to use art tools that they have been avoiding. For example, in Watchmen, Dave Gibbons intentionally uses ugly, ugly secondary colors in order to create kind of a sickly feeling as you read through that book. But this picture, which is not a great picture, this is a screen capture of an NTSC television from the 1980s. This particular painting, this is Grey Winter by the venerable landscape painter Bob Ross. And he had a fan who wrote him a letter saying, I love landscape painting. I think it's beautiful. I can't do it, unfortunately, because I'm colorblind. The writer was green-blue colorblind, which is one of the rare forms of colorblindness. And so Bob Ross said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I can't do the Bob Ross voice, and I'm not going to try." If you want to see him make this, it is season 7, episode 11 of The Joy of Painting. Bob Ross made this painting using only 3 of his trademarked colors: titanium white, midnight black, and Alzarian crimson. And he did this to demonstrate that he could execute all of his painting principles, even if he had to restrict himself to only 3 colors. And in doing so, showed that landscape painting was completely accessible to his colorblind fans. So, yeah, and it easily, though, this painting fits right in with any other Bob Ross painting. So, oh man. So that is all that I had today. 45 minutes, pretty good, pretty good. I'll go back to any slides if you want and take any questions. I'm not seeing a lot of the questions, so if you want to ask a question, throw it in an event chat instead of whatever channel you're doing it in now, and I'll be more than happy to answer anything.
I'm going to read one out of that chat that you can't see because there's one in there. This is from Flamecrest, who I think had to step out. But can you give some advice or speak to playing in an alternate timeline, for instance, when Echo Base wasn't attacked mere weeks after they set up camp? And how often or intense can you make up your own lore or twist it to suit your campaign? For example, if you don't know enough, quote unquote, about Star Wars.
That's perfectly acceptable. I'm actually kind of doing that with my Force and Destiny campaign right now. I'm kind of branching off from the Old Republic a bit. It's perfectly acceptable to do so, and even if your understanding of Star Wars, like, nobody has a complete understanding of Star Wars except for George Lucas, but yeah, you can definitely branch off. I would say figure out, so Echo Base, let me see, what was Echo Base? Echo Base was Hoth, that's right. So they had more time on Echo Base. So, you know, this of course does take a lot of work on your part as the GM. You have to imagine what Echo Base could have accomplished had it not been attacked. You know, maybe the rebels could have gathered more allies, potentially put together a more effective strike group. Han could have repaired the Millennium Falcon accurately. You do have to stretch out your imagination a bit, but again, there are still going to be moments on that road of trials that the main characters are experiencing. Of course, they are outside of their initiation. They're in their road of trials, and so those with events of the road of trials would still happen. They would maybe take different forms, but they can still happen for sure. I hope that's a decent answer. Patrol in the Mojave asked, intriguing how a dam became the Death Star. We need to see more super weapons that are just useful public works projects that the rebellion still wants to destroy. I think one of the reasons it inspired the Death Star is because the Germans had placed torpedo nettings in front of the dam. So even if you dropped a bomb or a torpedo into the water, as the propulsion or the momentum carried it forward, it would get caught in the nets and blow up early. The weapon that was used on the dams was a drum that was given a backspin before it was launched, and it would skip across the top of the water. And then once it reached the dam and stopped, it would actually sink on its own. And the photon torpedoes in Star Wars, they reach the exhaust port and immediately just sink right down, almost as if they had a backspin. So it's kind of a direct parallel to that in a way. But yeah, a lot of military projects are also public work projects, especially when you're really, really close to your adversaries. What kind of flavor text can I give my players to better evoke that classic Star Wars feel? I had a slide on this. I will make the slides available to everyone. Flavor text, the use of different certain language. The slide about what the heck is wrong with with laser sword. But we kind of graded some super weapons and things like that. And he suggests, let's see, give my players to better evoke that classic Star Wars feel. Look for classic terminology like lightsaber. Saber is a classic type of blade that was used for an officer's authority. So look for things like that. Look into medieval crafts and things. A loom, a forge. Jeepers, different leatherworking tools, different sewing mechanisms. Learn about like some of these medieval occupations and create like a sci-fi parallel to them. Is what I kind of recommend. Let's see. Any suggestions for Star Wars flavor during sessions with space battles? Look into, especially like World War II era terminology for naval battles and things like that. There's a reason that they use photon torpedoes. Well, also probably because of Star Trek, but that's still torpedoes. Torpedoes are torpedo. Star Trek didn't invent the torpedo. Blah blah blah. But ships have terms: port, starboard, bow, stern, broadside, battery, generator, bilge, things like that. There's a whole host of naval terminology that you can adopt, and different boat types. The gunboat, the schooner, the cruiser, the destroyer, all kinds of things like that can help give Star Wars a sort of classic World War II naval feel to it. That's all I think I could suggest with that. I'm kind of trying to integrate more space battles into my Star Wars right now, so that's work even I need to do.
When we talked about the hero's journey, the favorite slide of yours, it seems, are you talking about applying those to PCs or NPCs or both?
It can kind of be both. So your players are getting out of their initiation into their road of trials, but other characters, especially NPCs, they can be deeper into their road of trials. So like the character's mentor, and especially if you play a Force and Destiny game, it recommends that the players have a mentor. But something about that mentor really shows that they've gone through that road of trials. Alec Guinness, who won an Oscar for playing Obi-Wan Kenobi, just a couple of lines in Obi-Wan's hut before the dark times, before the Empire, just as he slowly dissolves into that 1,000-yard stare as he thinks about the past 15 or 16 years of his life and the horrible things that have come about. That is the type of NPC that you can include in your game who has already gone through their road of trials, and so it's useful for that. And also, as your characters are deeper and deeper into their road of trials, maybe they are the one who has to provide be the mentor character in someone else's initiation, and that's an important part of the storytelling too. You've got to be the one. You can't be the one taking all the risks. Sometimes, eventually, you got to step back and let other people take on the role of the hero. Some other things covered by Campbell in that book, the cosmological. Star Wars doesn't really go into the cosmological origins, like the origin of the universe or those sorts of things, very much, except at the very outer reaches of the expanded universe. And it also doesn't tend to go too much into the role of the hero. Typically, the role of the hero is of course the savior, but The hero can also be the great writer, the great lover, the great teacher, the great farmer. Campbell gives a couple examples of those, but primarily we put the hero in the role of the savior of the story. Any tips on maintaining immersion? The consistency will really help with immersion, but also immersion breaking is hard to avoid, especially depending on the type of friendship that you have with your fellow players. I mean, if you're attempting to put on a very serious podcast that is very immersive, try to keep everyone on track. Avoid telling meta jokes or referencing non-Star Wars sci-fi or non-Star Wars fantasy too much. But you're playing with your friends. You're trying to have a good time, and so things are of course going to come up. Have the Wookiee character only speak in its native tongue. That's okay. Yeah. Also the Hutt character. There are actually a couple of games. I know Roll20 has this system. I think Foundry offers it as an alternative, as an option. But a couple of online systems, game hosting systems, offer language-specific text. In other words, you can cite the language you're speaking when you type in a message, and only other player characters who can speak that language can understand what you're saying. Everyone will just get rah, 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 rah. So there is actually a way to implement that.
So for me, I know a lot of, or part of what I feel when I think about Star Wars is in their imagery, right? In big vistas and scenes and things. For example, the Tatooine, Tucson desert landscape. How do you kind of bring that into a game?
Definitely through meticulous description. Avoid referencing, especially 20th century technologies as you talk about things. How would I describe Tatooine? Don't describe hot. Describe what it is like to be in hot. Your robes are drenched from the sweat of the day, unless of course you're a Trandoshan, in which case you don't sweat. That sort of thing. What is it like to be hot? You look for shade, but there's none to be found. You look for water, but there's none to be found. There's only a few sparse oases away from the two suns of Tatooine. I'd really have to sit down and write that out, but typically when I describe something, I try to do it in about 5 sentences or less, but it can be done. Sand is coarse and rough, and it gets everywhere. The dunes shimmer in the heat. That's a good one too. That's something that you see. You see sand as well, but the shimmering of the mirage is something that you experience as a result. It's not just being hot. The scene is most obviously where Ben and Luke enter the cantina and see all the strange aliens. Where do you see that in the hero's journey? Let me go back to the hero's journey a bit. That may be a component of... Well, that's not necessarily a part of the hero's journey. That was, I think, done more... is more of a milieu event to kind of show how the alienness of Star Wars, because mostly we've seen... aside from the Tusken Raiders and the Jawas, we've seen mostly human characters up until that point. We hit the cantina scene. That is meant to show us just the sheer range of life forms that are out there in the greater galaxy. And so it is. I would say that it is a part of the threshold, because it is part of Luke's threshold too. We're seeing these for the first time, just as Luke is seeing them for the first time. The use of 20th century slang in shows like The Mandalorian took me out of the immersion a bit. Yeah, I remember a couple of those, not too many, just a couple. I think there's some in Rogue One as well that felt really out of place. And the original trilogy did a very good job, because there was a lot of slang from the 70s that could have accidentally ended up. And part of that you can attribute to George Lucas. Some of that you can attribute to Lawrence Kasdan, who did like the final draft of the movie to make sure the original trilogy, to make sure that they kept a lot of that slang out of it. But yeah, there is a little bit of that in The Mandalorian. And of course, sand is the funny thing about sand being coarse and rough and it gets everywhere is in the Clone Wars. There's a scene where Anakin describes Tatooine and he just says it's a desert and the desert takes everything, and that's actually somewhat more telling for his character. There is a computer game and video game called Journey, which is a purely visual version of the hero's journey. You can get it on Steam, and it's pretty good, but it does not feature the music of Journey, and so I don't like it for that reason.
You
Ha
can
ha
just play
ha.
your own soundtrack in the
Yeah, I can
background,
play my
right?
own Journey. What are some other good movies that borrow from the hero's journey? I'm trying to think. The one I remember the best, of course, is The Matrix because it came out the same year as uh, as The Phantom Menace. The players are supposed to be given starting stuff like ships or bases. What do you think are good replacements if I don't want to give them anything that big? You're as the GM, you are not obligated to give the players ships or bases, and also in some ways those aren't necessarily the players. Some alternatives. I mean, in my game, my first game that I ran, I didn't give players a ship because I didn't want to deal with ship stuff off the bat. I was pretty new to the system. You're not obligated to give them those things. You can hold off for sessions or wait for an arc to get them through, their initiation as well, and then give them something that big until they realize, hey, you've gone out into the greater galaxy. Is there any Star Wars media that you would recommend to people to get a grasp on Star Wars? Really? Yeah,
All of them?
yeah, all the episode 1, 2, and 3. Um, Let me think. Well, actually, let me think of some non-Star Wars that might give you a grasp on the Star Wars. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is really good, of course. Peter Jackson added some components of the hero's journey to Lord of the Rings that wasn't in the books. Interestingly, um, Bilbo Baggins running away from the Shire saying, "I'm going on an adventure." That didn't happen in the books. He was happy to go on the adventure with the dwarves. It was the dwarves that didn't want him. Interestingly. What was the tool that speaks in a language that only certain other characters understand? Sorry. Okay. That Roll20 has that feature. I think you can get it on Foundry VTT as an add-on. I don't use it yet, so yeah. I haven't seen how it works, but yes, there is an option in the chat mechanism where you can speak out loud, specify the language, and only people who can understand that language can hear what you're saying or read what you're saying, I should say. Ucha tuta solo. Gotta turn the subtitles on. All right, I don't see anyone else typing, so we may
Yeah.
call it a day
Wrap it
here.
up.
I've got some errands to run with the missus,
Well,
so
thanks, Dave, for
yeah,
another wonderful workshop.
sure thing.
And thanks to our audience for turning up. We will see you guys next month for another workshop and another Spice Pushes where Dave will be hosting GMs
Oh,
for a
that's
more
right.
casual discussion.
I'll be the special guest for the next
Be
Spice
interviewing
Pushers.
yourself.
So we're gonna need at least one extra panelist. So if anybody listening today would like to jump in, another GM would like to jump in and discuss this sort of stuff in greater depth or in lesser depth or with your own perspective. If you disagree with me completely, if you think I'm completely wrong, join us on Spice Pushers. Tell me all about it. I am happy to listen. But yep, that's it for us. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Keith for producing.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Let me turn off the screen, and that'll be that.